Welcome to this eLearn Security training video lesson. In this lesson, we will see how we can use some NetBIOS commands in order to gather information, enumerate network shares, and more. Keep in mind that the information we will gather from these commands are very important, as they may lead to future system exploitation. For the purpose of this video, a machine's been set up in order to illustrate several attacks based on the NetBIOS API. The attacker machine is a Windows 7 box, while the target of our tests, which is in the same network of the attacker, has the following IP: 192.168.99.162. Before moving on with further examination, let's make sure that the target machine is up and running and check if the NetBIOS is available. To do this, we will open a command prompt and execute the nmap tcp synscan on port 135. As we can see, the host and NetBIOS are up and running, so we can start interacting with some basic NetBIOS commands. The first tool we'll use is nbtstat. To see the help menu, we can call nbtstat with no arguments. The first step is to list the remote machine's name table. As we don't know yet the name of our target machine, we will use the capital A option, followed by the target IP address. As we can see, we get the table name. Here we can find information such as the names and the specific types of the listed records. The different numbers we can see between the name and the type have their own special meaning. The most important is 20, which indicates that there's a file service available under ELS WinXP. Since the file server service is running, we can see the available shares by using the netview command followed by the target machine IP. As we can see, we now know all of the shared resources that the machine has. Another useful command to use is netuse. Netuse connects or disconnects a computer from a shared resource, and it also provides information about the computer connection. We can see its manual here by typing netuse followed by the slash and a question mark. To connect our machine with one of the previous shared resources found, we can run netuse // the shared resource / and the specific shared folder we would like to access. As we can see, the command was successfully executed. To make sure that our machine has been connected to the previous share, let's browse the network area. As we can see, by clicking on the target machine, we are able to list its shared folders. Of course, we are not able to access them, as we currently don't have the correct credentials. Let's now move on and use more advanced tools for NetBIOS auditing. One of the most common tools used is the NetBIOS auditing tool, also known as NAT. NAT is a tool that combines user IDs and passwords in order to attempt a connection with the shared resource. Moreover, while attacking a system, it also returns a lot of information, such as the time zone of the server, the date, and more. Before executing NAT, let's see the other files contained in this folder. The most interesting files are userlist and passlist. If we open userlist, we can see a list of usernames that will be tested. Moreover, as we can see, the passlist file contains the password used during the connection attempts. By moving back to our command prompt, we can run NAT with no arguments in order to read its manual. As we can see, the usage is pretty simple. We have to call NAT and then add the -u parameter to set the username list, and the -p parameter to set the password list that NAT will use for the access attempts. Moreover, we also have to specify our target's IP address. During the attempts, we can see several bits of information that we may need to write down. Also, we can see that NAT has a high debugging level as we become informed about every action or attempt that's been made. At the end, we will look for successful login messages. We can see the SMB server string that allowed us to connect. Unfortunately, though, we're not able to access it too. NAT might be a very old tool, but it still has a valid program that can reveal important information. The next tool we will use is WinFingerprint. WinFingerprint is a GUI tool that, given an IP address or an IP range, performs several scans in order to find as much information as possible about the shared resources. Keep in mind that we have to execute it with administrator privileges. Let's execute it in order to inspect its interface and options. On the main window, we will get a list of all the available options. If we look closely, we can see the different methods and options listed. We can choose to perform a null session attack, a MAC address resolve, a service discovery, and more. For now, the only thing we will change is to enable the null session attack and change the IP range option into a single IP. We can now press Start to let the scan begin. WinFingerprint starts with an echo ping request in order to determine if the host is up. After this, it will execute the options and methods that we specified above in order to determine the NetBIOS shares. A nice feature here is that it hyperlinks the available NetBIOS shares so we can click on them in order to access the folders and files. Most of these shares can be normally browsed, while some others, like those with a $sign on the end, will probably require a username and password as they are administrative shares. From the output, we can also notice the security identifier value. We will copy this value as we're going to use it in a minute. Now, let's see if the machine is vulnerable to null session. To do this, we run against NetUse and specify the name of the target, followed by the string IPC $space, double quote, space, slash, user : double quote. Before executing it, it's important to understand what null session is. Windows authentication scheme relies on the user administrative unit. This means that when we create new users, we assign them permissions, restrictions, rights, and so on. On the other hand, Windows supports a special kind of user, the null one. Many people know this as the anonymous user, and it requires no username or password to be accessed. Moreover, null user is also able to access certain information and places inside the network, meaning that an account with no credentials is able to gain an incredible amount of information. The problem with a null user is that this account was commonly used by inter-process communications. If the system is not properly configured to block null users from certain actions, anyone with NetBIOS connection to the system will be able to get as much information as he wants. What we're doing with this command is to establish a connection to the IPC administrative share, providing an empty username and password. Let's now execute the command to force a null session connection. As the command was successfully executed, we know for sure that a null session has initiated. Again, we can browse the network area and attempt to access the shared folder with name C. As we can see, we can list its files normally, but we don't have permission to access other folders or execute files though. Now, we can use other tools in combination with the SID discovered before in order to get more information. A very popular tool that we can use to find information from the SID value is SID to user. By providing the IP address or the name of the machine along with its SID, the tool will return information about the users behind the machine. Let's see an example. First, let's browse the tool folder and then call SID to user by specifying the name of the victim and the SID that we found with WinFingerprint. Notice that we have to replace the dashes with spaces. In the results, we can see three things. Firstly, we can see the username associated to that specific SID. The first name is initially blank. Secondly, we can see the domain, and finally, the SID type. The SID has a well-known structure. The last digits of an SID indicate different users. For example, the SID ending with 500 indicates the administrator, while an SID ending with 501 indicates the guest account. If we move to 502, we will see that there's no such user available. Let's now edit 502 with 1000. The difference here is that accounts with a last value equal or higher than 1000 are accounts that have been created by the user. If we set it to 1000, we can see the Help Assistant user, while with 1001, we get the Help Services group. If we keep increasing it, we will also see a username with the ID ELS. We can go forward and retrieve all the user accounts. As we've seen, we obtained several bits of information, but sometimes we may encounter larger networks with many more accounts. Doing this manually can be very tedious. Therefore, what we're going to use now is a tool named dumpsec that will automate everything for use. Dumpsec will automatically dump information like usernames, file system, groups, registry, and much more. As you can imagine, this is more than an auditing tool. We can use it either via GUI or command line. For the purpose of this video, the GUI version will be used. The first thing we have to do in order to properly set dumpsec is to specify the target IP. To do this, we click on Report and select Computer. Here we specify the victim's IP address and click OK. Once we set our target IP, we can start collecting information. Now, we have to choose what information we would like to gather. To do this, we click again on Report and click on Dump Users as column. Here, we can choose some of the available gathering options listed. By clicking OK, we can see that dumpsec successfully gathers all the data, such as username, SID, comments about each user, login information, and more. It's important to save this information as we may need it in future phases of our penetration test. The techniques we saw here involve the use of several basic NetBIOS and NetBIOS auditing tools. We highly suggest you explore these tools and their techniques, since they may reveal a very good amount of information. All the NetBIOS auditing methods we've seen rely on a Windows OS. Let's now move into a Linux box and perform similar tests. In Linux operating systems, one of the most known enumeration tools is Enum for Linux. Enum for Linux is a Perl tool to enumerate data from Windows and Samba hosts. It is the Linux version of the enum.exe tool on Windows. Before exploring Enum for Linux and see its options, we have to install some other tools. Keep in mind that the way this tool works is by using other common Linux tools used to access shared resources and more. Some of the tools that Enum for Linux uses to scan a target are SMB client, RPC client, net, and MB lookup. Let's now install all the dependency tools. The first one is polnoom. Polnoom is a Python script created to determine the password policy of a Windows machine. It's useful, and it will reveal more information while used with the Enum for Linux. We've already downloaded it, so we'll just open our terminal and extract the file. As Enum for Linux will look in the /user/bin folder for the file, we also have to move the downloaded file to this location. Another useful tool is LDAP Search. LDAP Search opens a connection to an LDAP server, binds, and performs a search using specified parameters. As we'll see, this will reveal information while using Enum for Linux. LDAP Search is included in the LDAP Scripts package, so we only have to install LDAP Scripts. To do this, we simply execute the apt-get install LDAP Scripts command and wait for the package installation to finish. As the package has been successfully installed, we are now able to move on with the Enum for Linux execution. First, let's see the help manual. To do this, we specify the -h parameter after calling Enum for Linux. As we can see, the tool offers many options. Since we want to gather as much information as possible, we will now use the -a option, which will perform a full scan. Moreover, in order to understand better how Enum for Linux works, we will also use the verbose mode by adding the -v argument. If we look closely on every attempt and scanning technique, we are able to see which program is being used with what arguments and for which reason. For instance, we can see that the NMB lookup was used to list the table name, SMB client to attempt a null session, RCP client to get the SID, and so on and so forth. As the enumeration by using the SID will take a while, and as we've already found some users, we're going to pause this process. A second look at the results will unveil what information we found. Here we've successfully listed the table names. We performed a null session. We have discovered the operating system information, found multiple usernames, listed the shares, found the password policy for domain, and enumerated the system users along with their groups. As we can see, with Enum for Linux we can get all the information we need. Thus, we won't need to run several different tools as we previously did with Windows. Now that we've gathered all the required information, we're also going to see how to list shared devices of a machine with the SMB client, which is one of the most common tools used for the NetBIOS enumeration. The first thing we will have to do is to list the shared names. To do this, we'll call the SMB client, along with a list option that can be specified with the -L argument. As we can see, we're able to view all the named shares. Now, let's see how we can access one of them. For instance, let's try to access work sharing. Let's type the SMB client command once again, but this time without any extra parameters. We just type 4 backslashes before the IP address, 2 right after, and then the folder we would like to access. As we can see, we've successfully opened the share. From here, we can execute several commands. Let's see what we'll get by listing the folders and files. A file, called congratulations.txt appears. To copy it on our local machine, we can use the get command, followed by the name of the file, and a local folder where we want to store the file. After exiting the SMB, we can inspect its contents by using the Linux command cat. Here, there is a message that tells us we exploited the null session. As we can see, we can use either Linux or Windows tools in order to enumerate Windows shares. It's up to the penetration tester to choose the tool to use. We strongly encourage you to play more with these tools in order to better understand their functionality. Thanks very much for joining us.